The Legend of a Suicide. That's your first book, I guess. What kind of a book has it become?
Well, it's something I worked on for 10 years, from when I was 19 until I was 29. So it was many different things over time. I threw away everything from the first 3 or 4 years because I was trying to write about my father's suicide, and everything was too direct when I first started. So I'd write about the day that we found out he died, for instance, and everyone's just running around crying, and it's not something anyone could read.
That's where you started.
That's where I started.
10 years ago.
Yeah. So I threw away everything from that time, and then over time I started to see that I had to tell the story indirectly. So the opening story is about fish. It's called ichthyology, the study of fish. And through the focus on fish that we caught in Alaska, and then fish, tropical fish in fish tanks, I ended up having an indirect way to tell my father's story. And that came about because I was reading a novel by Marilynne Robinson titled Housekeeping, and poems by Elizabeth Bishop, and I started to understand that greater emotional distance and the indirect way of telling a story
is more effective.
Yeah. And then the book overall gained a strange structure over those years, with a short novel, which is most of the book, and then framed by 5 shorter stories. And I think the reason I came to that structure was that no one in my family could agree on what the story was. So we didn't have one true story. Everyone in my family had a different version of who my father was, what happened, and what it all meant. And so it was really confusing. I mean, we were all kind of driven by shame and guilt and anger and all these things that distorted our stories. And so it took a long time to figure out how to tell it. It wasn't straightforward at all. And what I eventually found was that I was reading Chaucer a lot in graduate school. And I read his Legend of Good Women, which showed a different kind of story structure than I'd thought about before, which is just the structure of a series of portraits. So the title, Legend of a Suicide, really means a series of portraits of a suicide.
Okay.
The word legend is used in that older medieval sense.
Which means?
A series of portraits.
Okay.
Yeah.
The legend.
Yeah. And so the book is these 6 pieces that all reflect on each other and give a slightly different account of things. And together they form what I hope is closer to the truth of who he was and what his life meant and what his death meant to the rest of us.
Okay. Can we come back, please, in time and in history to his suicide? What happened? And when did it happen?
It happened March 15th, 1980, so about 30 years ago. And I worked on the book for 10 years, but then I couldn't get it published for 12 years. And that's why so much time has passed between now and then. And the way that I tell the story in the book is transformed. It really is fiction. It's different than what happened in real life.
Okay. So
there are a few different accounts, possibilities for his suicide in the book, but none of them are the way that it really happened, which was in Fairbanks, Alaska in 1980. And he was on his own in a house, new house with no furniture, and he was talking with my stepmother on the phone when he did it. And so he called her and he said, "I love you, but I'm not going to live without you." And this was after he had broken up their marriage through infidelity. And that was the second marriage that he had broken up that way, with my mother and then with my stepmother. He was sleeping with other women and broke up the marriages. But then my stepmother was finally moving on and had found another man. And he felt very betrayed that she was moving on, even though he had broken up the marriage. And so he called her and said, "I love you, but I'm not going to live without you." And she was working in an office in California. He was in Alaska. And she couldn't hear well, so she went behind a door and asked, "What?" And he had to repeat it again. And then he shot himself with a pistol. And she could hear the sounds afterwards, and really horrific kind of scene, especially for her. And it was especially cruel because 11 months earlier, she had lost her parents to a murder-suicide. So her mother had shot her father and then shot herself because her husband was leaving her, saying that for the last 15 years he'd been with this other woman, and their whole marriage had been a lie. and that was too much for her to take. So my stepmother had just been through the loss of her parents by murder-suicide 11 months before, and then my father called her and did this to her, and then sent her flowers, which she received 3 days later on her birthday. I mean, so the whole thing was really kind of just so disturbing and horrific and cruel that it took a long time to figure out how to try to write about that. And I couldn't write about it directly. I had to write other things. So.
And you tried different stories or different books before you started writing?
I was trying to write about him all the way along, for the 10 years, but I was trying to find indirect ways to tell that story. And so an example of how it came out indirectly is that 2 weeks before he died, he asked me to come spend a year up in Alaska with him, going back to Alaska, because I was living in California with my mom and sister at that point.
And what was your age by then?
13.
Okay.
Yeah,
You're still very, very young.
Yeah, so I was 13, and he asked me to come spend a year with him, and I said no, and then 2 weeks later is when he killed himself. And so I felt really guilty. You know, each one of us had guilt after the suicide, and I felt like if I had said yes, maybe he'd still be alive.
Okay.
So
and that's what haunted you for many years.
Yeah, for a long time, yeah. And so the short novel, which is most of the book, is the boy saying yes to spending a year going up back to Alaska with his father. Because in Sukwon Island, which is the short novel, the father and son homestead for a year in southeast Alaska on a remote island. And so that's the kind of transformation that the real story took into the fiction in each one of these. It's powered in the background by what really happened, but everything that actually happens in what I wrote is made up. It's just a reflection of that. And so this island that they go to, Sukwon Island, is an island that I've never been to, I've never seen, because I wanted it to be a landscape of imagination. So when they go for a hike, or the way the bay is shaped, you know, anything about that landscape, I wanted it to fit the story and not be incidental just because that's the way some island I really saw really is. But it's only 50 miles away from Ketchikan, so it's very familiar. It's the rainforest that I know from my childhood. And that rainforest is still really mythic for me. And I really tried to write this whole book through place. I tried to just... Through place.
Place.
Yeah, I would focus on the landscape and the place, the forest and the water.
Because?
Because that's the indirection. Again, I found I couldn't write the story if I wrote it too directly. If I just wrote about the emotions and the people and who they were, that just never seemed to work. It was too much. But if I wrote about the place, if I wrote about the forest, or I wrote about the water, then that was a way to have the other story come out from behind that.
The weather, for instance, is very, very important in your book.
Yeah, the weather is really present, and the forest is very important. The father goes for a long hike all the way around the island, and that forest is a mirror for him. So the book, most of the book, that short novel, Sukwon Island, is just two characters out in the wilderness, and that puts an enormous amount of pressure on the characters, because the wilderness is like a bare stage with just mirrors all around. You know, the father goes there to escape, but it's not a place that you can escape. You know, you run right into yourself in the wilderness, and so that forest really is present, and the forest is an indirect way of describing the interior life of the father.
Okay. What kind of a man was he?
He was a great father, actually.
Yeah, can you remember him?
Yeah,
Really?
I mean, that's one thing I was afraid of, is forgetting him and losing him. That
by
would happen
writing
over
the book,
time.
or by time passing by?
Just time passing and by life. I was afraid that would happen.
Okay.
And so one thing I was doing in writing, I think, is to remember him.
Okay.
And to keep him. And
so it's also sort of a portrait.
Yeah, it's attempting to bring him back to life in some ways, I think, or at least keep some part of him alive through memory. You know, I had a lot of denial after he died. Like, it was hard to believe that he died because I never saw a body. And I told everyone that he died of cancer for 3 years after his death. The suicide was too shameful, and I didn't want anyone to know. It felt dirty and shameful, and it felt like that extended to me. But I also didn't quite believe he was dead either. And I had these fantasies at night. I didn't sleep for like 15 years. I had insomnia. And I would lie awake for the first few years and imagine that maybe it was someone else who was killed, and maybe my father was out, you know,
Okay.
Who knows, working for the CIA or something, running through the tundra, through the snow. Like, I don't know, some way of trying to keep him alive. He was only a dentist. He liked hunting and fishing. So it was hard to come up with much of a story of how he'd still be alive. But it's just so hard to believe that someone that close is dead.
Oh,
and especially since he just died suddenly. I didn't expect it. And then I never saw any sign. And he just vanished. And it was just so difficult to believe that. So I think in writing I was trying to make him present again and bring him back.
And writing a novel on him, making him alive again, bringing him back to life again, sort of. Didn't you take a risk to idealize him in some sort of way?
Yeah, but and I felt that a little bit of that happened in the shorter stories. I felt that I'd been cowardly in those stories, and I hadn't gotten close enough to his despair and to really what was wrong. And so it's in Sukwan Island, the novel in the book, that I really tried to get closer, and I tried to understand what was happening for him at the end, exactly how he was spiraling downward and how his suicide became possible. And so I thought I was writing toward his suicide in that. And the book at that point takes a huge turn, an enormous surprise happens, a big change. And it's something I didn't see coming until I was halfway through writing the sentence. And it was just a complete shock. It changed everything. And when I went back the next day, I planned to cut that and just continue on with what my plans had been. Because this was really wrecking my plans, But I read through all the pages before, and I could see that was actually inevitable. That's what was supposed to happen. That there was all this pattern that had happened unconsciously in the writing, and that the writing had been just fundamentally out of control and unconscious. So that now I understand that that's what I like best about fiction. That's what I think is beautiful about writing fiction, is that it can take over and it can form pattern on its own. And that
if you're not afraid.
Yeah, and I was afraid because I wondered what would happen now with the second half. I mean, I had no idea. Now I had no plans, and I had no idea where to go. And so that to me becomes the most interesting writing in the book, is the second half of the novel. The first 20 or 30 pages of that, I had no idea where I was going to go. And so all of this stuff happened in the writing there that had needed to happen for years. About the denial, about never seeing him afterwards, and about believing finally in his death and his body being there, and describing what it's like to find someone or first find out that someone has died. All of that tougher stuff came out because I had no plan. So because of that experience, I've come to think that an idea is maybe the worst thing that can happen to a writer, and that plans are not a good thing. So I distrust my plans now, and I hope that when I write, that something else will take over, and that if I just focus on place and character, and especially place, and just describe landscape, that the story will come out, like what needs to happen will happen.
Maybe you idealized him a little bit in the novel, but nevertheless you painted extremely lonely people.
Yeah, it's true. I think he was very lonely at the end.
But the son.
Yeah, the son
probably very. I felt.
Yeah.
He was very lonely too.
Yeah, absolutely. The son ends up having to take care of his father in the piece, which is very strange. And he does feel that the father is so obsessed with thinking about the stepmother that it's almost like the boy isn't there. Like the father can't really see him and can't really interact with him. And the boy doesn't think that the father's ever going to get better, that it just is going to be endless. And he has a terrible kind of vision of his future out there on that island. And so that was very scary to write. I mean, it was really uncomfortable, and I definitely have, still a kind of loneliness in some ways, not as bad as what the boy's experiencing there. I mean, I'm happily married, and I have friends and such.
You live a stable life.
Yeah, but there is still kind of I do feel kind of in a fundamental way that I'm alone, and I think my father had felt that also, and so that was one thing I was exploring in the book.
Did you, when you were much younger, and you were thinking about a career, did you deliberately try to become a writer, or is it?
I always wanted to be a writer, and I never felt like it was something I had to, try to become or want to become, or it's just I always wanted to do that. So clear back from before I could write, my mother would have me tell stories about gray squirrels in California, and she would write down the stories. And then as soon as I could write, I would write all the stories of our hunting and fishing every year and give them out as Christmas presents. We would laminate the pages and I'd make little illustrations and we'd hand them all out. And I always knew it's what I wanted to do, on through high school and college. But I could never make any money with it, and so that was the problem. So I've always had a struggle with second jobs. I always knew I wanted to write first, but I've always struggled with what that second job is. So for a while it was teaching as a lecturer, but I couldn't get my book published for 12 years, so I couldn't move on to being a professor. So I actually went to sea and became a captain. For 8 years I was a captain on sailing boats around the world, like on the Turkish coast and Greek islands and in Mexico and the Caribbean and all over the place. And that was a really disastrous kind of career. Actually, I love boats and I love sailing. And I like building boats, but I sank.
You sank?
Yeah, my wife and I sank on our honeymoon and lost everything. This boat that was our business and our home. So my other career path didn't really go that well. But then finally, no agent would send the book to publishers. So finally, after 12 years, I sent it to a contest, and it won the contest. And there was a press that had to publish whatever won the contest. So the book was actually published with no editor or agent agreeing to publish it. It was just because it won the contest. And that finally opened up things much more for me.
And are publishers not interested in publishing books on suicide?
I think it was because of the topic, because of suicide and the shame around suicide.
Too shameful or too troubling? Or?
Yeah, especially for an American audience, I think it's tougher.
Why?
Well, I think Europeans are just braver readers. Europeans in a range of countries here seem to me more willing to read a range of work, including stuff that might be psychologically more difficult or about a tough topic, whereas Americans are really kind of babies about that. I mean, they really, we're so careful about what's said in high schools, like pretending that kids don't know about tough things, and our politicians can't say anything. It's really, we're a culture that doesn't acknowledge very much
suicide.
And suicide is something that doesn't get talked about very much at all. And then the other problem for publishing it was the structure, having a short novel framed by 5 stories, with 3 stories in the front, 2 stories in the back. That didn't make sense to publishers either. They want just one piece. They want it to be very simple. So those were the problems, I think, why it didn't get published for so long. But I feel really happy that what's happening now, it's now coming out in 10 languages with a bunch of different publishers, and I feel like I get a new life in every country along with the book, and it's been really exciting.
What makes you so successful around the world?
I don't know, there's just a lot of luck in publishing, I think. I just got lucky that a New York Times reviewer liked the book and wrote a great New York Times review, and that made publishers in other countries interested. And then,
but there are books that sell very well in the Netherlands. There are books that sell very well in Norway or in China or what. But there must be something that's collective or international or.
It's had the same kind of response, like in the UK and France and Australia and New Zealand and now it's just coming out in Spain as well as coming out here in the Netherlands.
And what's the mainstream in?
And I think what's consistent across all of them is that relationship between the father and son and the kind of intense psychology and emotion of what's going on and that basic loss from the suicide. That's something that seems to be read across any culture that it's hit so far. That seems to be understood and seems to communicate. And And then the other thing is that Alaska and the wilderness of Alaska, I think is interesting to people, because it's such a huge place with so few people and so majestic. And it still is really mythic in my imagination. I mean, when I was a kid, when I was like 4 years old, running around the rainforest in Ketchikan, I imagined that I was being chased by wolves and bears, and we actually had wolves and bears and moose and all kinds of things in that forest. And there was always this feeling of being watched, that it was always present and it was very alive. And it also had so much wood that had fallen on the forest floor and so much growth that as I would run along, I could fall through the floor and disappear completely. Like I'd fall into a second floor. And that was just amazing to me, that kind of presence of the forest. It always felt like it was kind of there to capture me or something. And
but
so
are you saying that's especially appealing to, for instance,
yeah, I think
a
something
European audience?
I think a place that's that wild and that risky, where there really are things out there and you really are being watched, and it's away from human rules and human control and human society in some ways. I think that idea of wilderness is really attractive to a range of people. It's still important for me in thinking about it, and I think it's a place where if you focus on wilderness, as I said before, it becomes a giant mirror. And so it's in some ways a very essential way to tell a story, to tell it through a landscape.
And what makes it to a mirror?
It's a mirror because it doesn't have any meaning by itself. The wilderness doesn't actually mean anything on its own. It only means what we make it to mean. And so as soon as you place people in wilderness, as you describe the wilderness, you're describing the people. And that's something that came about through two things, through what I was reading and through my own experience. My experience was that like the first salmon I caught was taller than I was, my first king salmon. And that was really amazing. I fought it on the pole for 45 minutes. I was being pulled down the river, and my dad was holding my back to hold on to me. And that just felt like a battle, with that fish. And then my grandfather caught a 350-pound halibut, which is like 100 kilos or so. And I remember that fish was so big that it couldn't be pulled up off the surface or off the bottom, because it would know it was moving and then it would just clamp down. So my dad had to use his fingertips on the fishing line, just bit by bit. I mean, this thing that seemed impossible to me, that you could bring up a huge fish by fingertips. And it took a long time, it was 100 meters to come up. And I remember looking over the side of the boat and seeing the color of the water was about the same color as the back of a halibut. It was like a dark brown green. And I remember trying to imagine seeing the fish, and I just saw sunspots, and then finally I saw it. But then it became bigger and bigger and bigger as it came up to the surface. And by the time it got up to the boat, it was just impossible. It was something I couldn't even imagine, it was so big. And I always think of that as a metaphor for how writing works with wilderness, that if you just pay attention to it, it shifts and it shapes and it grows and it becomes different things and it starts to suggest. And so that's what writing about that landscape is like for me in Alaska. But it also comes from writers that I really like, because I really love reading other landscape writers. So Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian, for instance, he talks about a line of mountains, a ridge line, in the southwest of the U.S. And he talks about them having their true geology was not stone but fear. And he always does that kind of extension from the literal landscape to the figurative. So instead of stone, we go to the abstract noun of fear, and that's how we start to feel theme developing and what the landscape is about and what the book is about. And you can also see that in Faulkner, which is where Cormac McCarthy borrows that from, and in Annie Proulx and Marilyn Robinson and Elizabeth Bishop's poems. And so that's what I really love to read also, is that kind of extension of the actual landscape into a figurative landscape.
Okay. Was writing the book therapy for you, or?
It was therapeutic. I mean, I definitely felt a lot better, and I feel like my life is good now and everything's clear, and I feel like what was ugliest in my life was transformed through the writing into moments that are lovely even, and I think that it has a tremendous transformative power. But I think that writing has to be better than therapy. It has to be more than just therapy, because I think therapy and writing are both about truth, but I think only writing is about the beautiful. And I don't think therapy really has that focus necessarily, but writing really does. You have to transform something in writing, and you can't give people just ugliness and pain and just suffering. You know, no one wants to read through that. You know, there has to be a transformation where the vision is beautiful in some ways, even if it's tragic.